Welcome to And All Shall Be Well. I am your host, Megan Rohrer, and today's episode is with a special guest, Joanie Euster, who is, in my mind, something of a superhero because of how much she has lived through, how often she volunteers, and all of the wonderful work that she's able to get done in the world. Joanie is someone who was overwhelmed by grief and tried to find something other than grief, tried to find whatever's on the other side of it, and instead discovered that being a volunteer and a helper and actually immersing more in the grief was what ended up being the path that is the call of her life. The way Joanie describes it is breathtaking and beautiful. And if you have lost loved ones due to HIV and AIDS or through breast cancer, might be a triggering one. But if you give her story a listen, I think what you'll find is that you don't have to have all the answers at the beginning of your journey. You can be curious. You can be someone who's just trying to meet a deadline and late at meeting your deadline. And you can still, as they say, muddle through somehow. And when you then look back in retrospect, you discover that you made it through something. And I hope for those of you out there who are living with grief, who are moving through grief, who are feeling it bubble up and are wondering if you're ever going to get on the other side of it, I hope Joanie's story helps you feel a little less alone and ponder maybe what are some of the things you want to do while you go on this grief journey.
My name is Joanie Euster, and the hardest question for me to answer is, so what do you do? Because I do a lot of different things. These days, I have a day job in the nonprofit sector, helping people with breast and ovarian cancer. But I also spend an equal amount of time each week doing volunteer work. That's who I am.
And what kinds of intersections do you embody in your being and in your volunteer life?
That's a phrase that I'm not familiar with. I don't think in terms of embodying intersections. I'm just all over the place. You remember the old children's thing, butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker. I've never fit into one mold because I have interests all over the place. But my volunteering journey, if you want to use that word, began late in my life when I was 35 during the heart of the AIDS crisis. And that's where I found my calling, I guess you'd call it. There was no way to sit on the sidelines as all my friends were getting sick and dying, or dealing with their partners and friends who were sick and dying. San Francisco was just awash in grief. And my epiphany came at a time when I was dealing with a lot of personal grief as well. My mother, my aunt, my uncle all died within a few months of each other at the same time. One of my best friends was dying. It was just a very challenging time. And at first, I just didn't know how to get involved. I didn't know how to start. Where do I go? Who do I connect with? And that's when a very dear friend set me on my path. She said, Joanie, you're a mess. You need a Shanti volunteer. And most of your listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with the Shanti Project, but the Shanti Project was created before the AIDS crisis to help terminally ill cancer patients and to provide peer support to people at the end of their life. And so the model was already in place when the AIDS crisis came along and was there in here. So when my friend suggested I become a client and turn to them for assistance, I was confused because at that point I thought you had to be terminally ill to be a client of Shanti. And no, they provided an emotional support volunteer for me, a lovely former nun who just met with me a couple times a week, just for coffee or for a walk in the park. And we just talked, because when a person is drowning in grief, like I was at that time, you can't turn to your friends anymore because they were drowning in grief too. And it's just like nobody wanted to hear this, but this lovely volunteer did. And she listened to me with compassion and an open heart and no judgment. And after, I don't know how many sessions, she turned to me and said, Joanie, inside what you really need to do to get beyond your grief, you need to help other people. You need to volunteer. Okay. And that turned my life around, and I've been doing it ever since.
And I often see you at the front of protests and at gatherings of the AIDS quilt. And usually if there's a drag queen speaking out in public, you're hugging them beforehand and giving them a cheerleader pep talk. How did you become involved with the AIDS quilt?
That was my very first step in volunteer. The AIDS quilt was begun in 1987. I heard about this project that was starting in the Castro, creating panels to memorialize loved ones who had died. And they were taking the quilt to Washington, D.C. as an act of protest. It started as an act of protest as much as a memorial. They were taking it to Washington, D.C. to literally lay our dead at the feet of Congress and our lawmakers and say, you need to help us. Because at that time, the government wasn't doing anything to help this crisis. And I wanted to be part of it. But at that same time, my mother became terminally ill. So I spent the fall of 1987 taking care of her. But the next year, they said, oh, we're going back to Washington in October 8th, 1988. And that's when I decided, after having met with this lovely former nun for a while, that I'm not quite ready to volunteer, but I'd like to make a panel for a friend of mine. I'm a lousy designer and an even worse seamstress. So I turned to a friend of mine, Eric, and said, can you help me make a panel for our mutual friend, David Percival? I had an idea of what I wanted to do. I didn't know how to turn it into a thing. And so Eric helped me design it and laid it out, and I sewed it. And of course, they had a deadline to get the panels in order to make it to Washington, D.C. in time. And of course, being me, I was always right up against the deadline. The deadline was at midnight on September, whatever. And at 11:35, I finished my last stitch and called a cab and raced to the Castro and got there 2 minutes after midnight. And the door was locked. And the workshop at that time was where the restaurant Catch is now. The whole front of the workshop was glass. And I could see that there were people inside. They'd started turning off the lights. I could see there were people inside. And I rattled the door and was standing there crying with my panel. And some wonderful person, and I will never know who it was, opened the door and let me in and accepted my panel from me. But as I gave it to them, I saw right inside the door this mountain of FedEx boxes and UPS boxes. And I realized that each one of those was a panel that had been made for a loved one who had died. It was like a cardboard cemetery, this huge stack of them. And I realized I was giving these people more work. And I said to myself, wow, I can't just give them more work and walk out the door and go away. I need to stay and help. And so I did. For the next 3 days after I'd get off my day job, I would go to the workshop and sew and do anything I could to help. And I'd stay until 1, 2, 3 in the morning, go home, grab a couple of the hours of sleep, and then go back to my day job and then come back to the quilt at night. And once I started there, I was just hooked for life. I'm still part of the quilt family and the National AIDS Memorial. I didn't feel ready to help human beings yet. I thought I can sew. What I didn't realize is that when you work on the quilt, you end up being an ad hoc grief counselor. People were constantly coming in the door, crying, giving us their panels. And we were there to talk to them, to accept them, accept their grief, accept their love, and give them a place where they could safely talk about what they were going through. Yeah, the quilt was my gateway drug, shall I say, to the world of volunteering, and it just blossomed from there.
The world has had no shortage of grief since the AIDS crisis, and especially since we still haven't found that full cure yet.
Exactly.
We are people still perpetually in grief and celebrate that people are living, but also in this sort of, there's still quilt panels being made, right?
There are still quilt panels being made. I still have 3 or 4 unfinished ones in my house that I've owed my friends for over 30 years. But what I found, or I've continued to work on quilt displays throughout all these years, 35 some odd years. When I work at a quilt display, people come to the display. Sometimes they just stumble upon it. They're just walking around and they, oh my God, what is this? People come largely because the rest of the world has moved on and has forgotten about AIDS. Those of us who have stayed in the field know that AIDS is not over, that there are new infections every day, that there is a vast inequity in who gets AIDS and how they are treated. The Deep South in the United States is the hotbed of new infections due to lack of education, lack of access to prophylactic drugs, lack of treatment options, due to stigma. All sorts of things are leading to the Deep South being where the greatest number of new infections and deaths are happening. Quilt is, yes, it's a memorial, but it's a protest, and it's a tool for social justice as we try to raise awareness, stigma, people the health care they need. When people come to see the quilt, this happens over and over and over again. No one in their life that they can talk to about their loved ones who they've lost, and they come to the quilt, and it's a safe place for them to talk, to grieve, to laugh, to remember, to share stories, something that they don't have in their lives. I'll never forget this one woman who came to see the quilt in Washington, D.C. in 2012. We were on the National Mall with the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. And she came by and heard us reading aloud the names of the quilt, which is my job there, and saw the panels laying down. And she said, I'd like you to read my brother's name because no one has mentioned him in 20 years. We can't talk about him at home and with our family. Read her brother's name. She got to read her brother's name out loud. And it was this immense load lifted off of her. This healing process was happening right there just to be able to talk about it. What keeps me going with the quilt all these years, knowing that we can provide healing. It's such a simple thing, acknowledging people's grief, acknowledging the names of the people they've lost. It's so simple. It costs nothing to be kind, to be open, to be present for them.
I know you to be a very strong person who shows up at heart events. Like if there was a tragedy in San Francisco, you would be there with candles at the front of the space, making room for whatever conversation and space needed to happen. But what is your sort of like wellness toolkit for being ready before those moments? Like what fuels you in your in-between spaces? Who's the person pumping you forward, or the practices pumping you forward that are helping with that?
Back in the 80s when I started doing AIDS work, members of my family, my siblings and my mom would ask me, how can you do such hard work? How can you be around dying people all the time? And really, how could I not, was really the answer. This is where I was needed. This is the work that I have to do. What keeps me going? I have often said that I couldn't be who I am and do what I do if I didn't have the world's most supportive husband. Most people don't see him. He's behind the scenes. He's the one cooking dinner so that I have something to eat when I come home from a rally or a vigil. He's the one encouraging me. He's a poet, and he writes the most incredible poems about the work I'm doing and about his love and support for me. I couldn't do what I do without him. People ask if I have pets, and no, I can barely feed myself. I couldn't take care of an animal, but Mark takes care of me. And I also have an incredible circle of friends and fellow volunteers. You're one of them that I can count on, that I can turn to and say, hey, we need to be at this place at this time. Can you be there? And more often than not, people say yes. Going out on the street, waving a sign, doing a protest, doing a vigil is really hard to do by yourself. You need critical mass. You need more people. And I've developed a network over the years of people that I can reach out to and help spread the word get people together. Together we can lift things up. One person alone can't do it. It's incredibly hard work.
Yeah, it takes a community, and it's always been lovely to be able to send that the other way too. Be like, hey, Joanie, come show up. We need bodies, and we need kind bodies, and we need bodies who have
Right.
the wisdom of having been here before to know that we're not going to all fall apart because this is happening, but we're also going to fight.
And at this point, in doing this kind of work for over 35 years, I know the drill. I know what it takes. And lately, as my body is slowing down, and there have been a lot of demands on my time and energy, particularly this past year. I've had a lot of personal grief and caregiving to do this past year. I've been starting to learn how to say no. And that was a new one for me because I'm not used to saying no. I've had to, because literally people are lying in bed, not being able to take care of themselves, needed me. And I had to be there. For 35 years of dealing with other people's grief, I've had to deal with a lot of my own this year. And I saw that Open House had a seminar or a panel discussion a few months ago on anticipatory grief, which I found I'd never heard that term before. And it hit me right there. Anticipatory grief. And I realized I'd been there before when my father died when I was 19 and sent me in a tailspin. That was like, I'd lost other relatives before, but my dad at 19, that was really, and for years, I was mentally, emotionally waiting for the other shoe to drop. When would I lose my mother? Then I lost her when I was 35. But also during the AIDS crisis, at first I found myself shying away from making new friendships with young gay men. I was afraid of losing them. And I recently went out for cocktails with one of those men that I had shied away from in 1989, I think, when we met. And he's now a hardy middle-aged man. And I hadn't seen him in 35 years. He came to town and connected with me, and we went out for cocktails. And I told him, I am so sorry that I held off for so long. We reconnected on Facebook a few years ago, and he's a joyful part of my life now. Now that I'm older, and so is my immediate circle of friends, it's on all our minds. If we survived the 80s, here we are now in our later years, looking at each other saying, either I'm going to be speaking at your memorial service or you're speaking at mine. Which of us is cleaning out whose house? This is imminent. And there are times when the thought of the loss that lies ahead of me in the very near future is overwhelming. I lost one of my sisters in January to Alzheimer's. It was not a surprise. She had been declining for several years. But a sister, that hit me right where it got me right where I live. And I'm looking at my two remaining older siblings and just, I can't imagine how I'm going to deal with that. If I survive my husband, I can't imagine how I'm going to deal with the grief that I know is lying ahead. The people most important to me. I know somehow you do manage to get through the grief. You live with it. You embody it. And I also know from going back to the beginning of this conversation, from my Shanti, my first introduction to Shanti, that there are people who can help you. And I have a wonderful therapist and good friends.
I'm glad to be one of them, and we'll definitely do some more not recorded for the general public conversations, which is always good. I typically close out conversations by asking people if they want to share how people can connect with them. But as people might notice from your conversation here and my experiences of you, is you are the person who's going to teach the protest song, but you don't necessarily want to do the speech at the vigil. And we've chatted because one of my favorite Christmas traditions is to be able to come over and get your husband's new poetry book, which I don't know, it's good marketing that it always comes out during the holiday time. So how about, instead of promoting yourself and how people can connect with you, how about I invite you to share a little bit about the newest book? And by the way, your husband also was one of the coolest San Francisco tour guides of the whole city. And in addition to fabulous poetry about Joanie, it's also this amazing, Sometimes it's woven in history that nobody ever knew about. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's just, I noticed a stoplight and you're like, what? That stoplight isn't anything. But we didn't stop to notice, right?
I'm out there in public a lot, but I'm not a publicly known person. And I'm perfectly happy to give speeches, but I'm not usually asked. So I don't have my own website or anything. I do write for a column every 2 weeks for the San Francisco Bay Times. People want to get in touch with me, they can get in touch with the Bay Times. Please read my articles. I work hard on them. And my articles are focused largely on how you can help. So if I bring up an issue like book bannings or anti-trans legislation, I'll do my rant, but also how you can help, who you can contact to get your voice out there and support the community. I was brought on board to the Bay Times as a straight ally. They wanted a voice from that side of the curtain, and there I am. But yes, I'm married to a wonderful poet, and he's out doing a tour today. He does a tour that's part walking and part public transportation. So they're on buses and F lines and cable cars and everything. But his latest book is called Something to Be, and it's poems about the workplace, about work, and define work any way you like. There's lots of different types of work, but it's beautiful, it's accessible. I'm sorry to say that it's from a publisher so small that the only way to get it is on Amazon. But Merck J. Mitchell, you see that? Yeah, there we go. Poems on the Workday. He also has a YouTube channel, Mark J. Mitchell. I have the J in there because there are a lot of Mark Mitchells out there, where he reads poems and often on locations in San Francisco where he's written a poem about it. And I'm in some of those videos too. um,
That's awesome.
yeah. So volunteering is a form of self-care. It's taking care of the inner me. We all have to make a living, so I do things for a living. And I'm supremely grateful right now that my current day job and many of my jobs over the years have been basically like volunteering. They're for the causes that I believe in. I did a lot of work in the AIDS community and breast cancer community and other communities, but a lot of jobs over the years were just for the paycheck. And to me, it was soul deadening. I couldn't survive. It was like having no oxygen to breathe. Being able to spend my day doing work that I know helps people with a community of like-minded people who all have a common goal, that to me is the ultimate self-care. And if it pays the rent too, yay. That's older. I realize that I have a limited time left on this earth. And I just want to make sure that I'm using it wisely. I've spent a lot of time in my earlier days that was wasted. I want to make sure that I've made some sort of difference.
You've made a difference to me, and I love you. And
I'm back at you.
yeah, I'll keep joining you out there on the streets. And if you encounter Joanie at a march or a protest, hand her the mic every once in a while, or hold the flag for her, or make sure she's going to eat later. Let's all pitch in.
Thank you for listening to this conversation with Joanie Euster. I hope that you, like me, were enriched by her stories and inspired to be more active in your community through volunteering or by just showing up when people need you and caring for others that are in the world that matters to you. If you appreciate this podcast, we hope you'll like or subscribe or comment or maybe listen again. It regularly comes out every Tuesday, but sometimes we have special episodes that just pop up. If you want to support us, you can also pop in on Patreon and be someone who supports this work in an extra special way. And no matter if you are able to follow any of the advice, no matter if you feel like you can navigate grief with the dignity that Joanie has or not, know that I will be here rooting for you on social media throughout the week, on this podcast regularly, reminding you that when you've got it together, when you don't have it together, when you are overwhelmed, when you are on top of it, no matter what is going on for you and your ability to try to seek wellness, I'm rooting for you. and all will be well, because the next thing's going to happen and you can move towards it. And whether it ends up the way you expected or not is a whole nother story. Well, maybe next time we can chat about your story. Take care.